Hello and welcome to the 8th video in our lecture on access control policies and mechanisms. So far we've discussed the discretionary and the mandatory access control type of policies, and in those policies the access rights are based on the individual users, their identity or their username. Sure, you can group users by groups and so on and so forth, but every user is identified by a single identifier or username. In this third category of access control policies we're going to discuss in this video called RBAC, we're going to discuss policies where the access rights are based not on the identity of a user but on their role. So the idea of a role is actually uh, very useful. So in most organizations, a user can take on different roles at different times of day. So for example, I have a job title of professor, but throughout the day, I could be playing the role of an instructor while I'm in the classroom. And then later in the morning, I could be playing the role of an advisor when I'm meeting students with an advising appointment. And then in the afternoon, I could be playing the role of a committee member when I'm meeting with the members of a college level committee, for example, and so on and so forth. So at different times of day, users play different roles, and their access right should, in this context, be based more on the role that they play than on their identity. So it would make sense that, for example, as an instructor, I have access to a bunch of resources that have to do with the content of my course and maybe nothing else. But as an advisor, maybe I should have access to the academic record of my advisees and so on and so forth. And then as a member of a committee, I would have access to whichever documents pertain to the functions, the role, or the job of those committee members. So the idea then in this RBAC or role-based access control policy, the access rights should be based on the role that the user is currently taking on. So let me show you this picture right away because I think it explains the setup very nicely. So the idea is that we have the users or subjects on the left, and we have the resources or objects on the right. And then we have an intermediate column called the roles. And so we have a double mapping of users to roles in the first place, and then of roles to resources. So what's interesting in this system is it has quite a bit of flexibility because there is a many-to-many relationship between users and roles. So for example, every user can play several roles simultaneously. And similarly, every role can be taken on by several users simultaneously. So it's a many-to-many relationship between users and roles. Now, similarly, the relationship between roles and resources is also many-to-many because in a particular role, a person in a particular role would need access to several resources. And on the flip side, a resource could be accessed by people with different roles. So it's a pretty flexible system. And the key idea then is to assign access rights to users based on their roles, and these roles could change over time. So how would we implement this such a system? Well, the neat thing is that we can extend the access control matrix representation that we discussed earlier in a discretionary model. The difference here is that we're going to have or use two matrices instead of one. So again, it's probably easier to show a picture here to illustrate those two matrices because they will have a different structure. So in particular, the first matrix on the left is going to be indexed by users or subjects on the left or on the rows, and then it will be labeled with roles, which is the new concept for this approach on the columns. And these entries in the matrix are basically a binary entry, 0 or 1, or there's an X or no X. And what that means is if this entry is set, that means this user is currently playing this role. And if a cell is empty, that means that this user is not playing this role. So again, this matrix represents the mapping from users to roles that appeared on the left half of the previous picture. And this is just saying which user is playing which role. And then there's a second matrix right here on the right, which is basically the same as the one we use in a discretionary model, except that the labels on the rows will be the roles. So remember, now the access rights are based on the roles, not on the subjects per se. And then the labels on the columns are going to be the resources, the files, and uh, directories, and so on and so forth. So an entry then in this matrix is exactly the entry that we would have in a discretionary model, which is a particular access right. So for example, in this role, the person who has this role is allowed to read and is the owner of this file. But the person with this role is allowed to write this file, but only people in that role are allowed to read it, and so on and so forth. For a process, these are processes, I guess. You would have the ability to wake up a process, or to stop a process, or put it to sleep, and so on and so forth. And then for a directory, you'll be able to seek through it, to search a file, and so on and so forth. So this is just the typical access control matrix that we discussed earlier, but now we need two matrices because we have two mappings. One matrix for this set of arrows and one matrix for this set of arrows. So the advantage of the role-based access control policy is that it makes it much easier to implement the important design principle that we talked about earlier in the course, called the principle of least privilege. So again, the idea is that people should be given access rights that are the minimum that they need to do their job. And so now, because we have this new level of granularity called the role, it's much easier to assign to a user a particular access right that is the minimum number of access rights they need to do their job, and nothing more. So again, as an advisor, I may need to access some academic records from your file, but as an instructor in the classroom, I certainly have no reason to access that data, and I shouldn't be given access when I play that teacher role. So it's a pretty nice approach to designing an access control policy. The last thing I want to mention is how flexible is it in practice. Remember that in many environments, things change quite a bit. So typically, though, what happens is that even though the number of users in a company or an organization changes quickly, for example, in a university, new faculties are hired regularly, and more importantly, students are coming in and graduating all the time. So the number of users changes a lot. The good thing, though, is that the number and the nature of the roles does not change that often. So, the roles of teachers and advisors and students and committee members, these basically don't change at all. And this is good because that means you can accommodate a lot of changes in the user population in those systems without having to change a good chunk of the system, because the roles themselves do not change, at least most of the time. So in practice, what that means is the matrix on the left, this one will have to be updated often, the mapping of users to roles, but the second matrix of roles to resources and access rights would probably not change very often. So again, this RBAC policy is a very nice structure that allows it to adapt to changing environments, and also allows us to implement the principle of least privilege, which is extremely important in the context of computer security.